Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that exists as much in feeling as it does on any map. A road so deeply woven into the American imagination that even people who have never set foot in the United States somehow know its name, its number, its particular shade of faded promise. Tonight, we're driving Route 66. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A two-lane ribbon of asphalt stretching westward across an enormous continent. The smell of warm pavement after summer rain. A roadside diner glowing amber in the early evening, its neon sign humming softly against the darkening sky. A long horizon where the land flattens into something almost oceanic, and the road ahead simply continues, quietly, patiently, toward a place you haven't reached yet. If you find these sleepy journeys through history comforting, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely feels right. And if you'd like to leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there, I always love knowing where in the world these stories find you. Now, let's ease into this together. The story of Route 66 begins not with asphalt, but with ambition. In the early decades of the 20th century, the United States was a country that had grown enormous faster than it could properly connect itself. Railroads had stitched the coast together, yes, but the land in between remained a patchwork of rutted farm roads, muddy wagon trails, and unmarked paths that made long-distance automobile travel genuinely dangerous. The automobile itself was still a relatively new thing. Henry Ford's Model T had made car ownership accessible to ordinary Americans for the first time, and by the 1920s, people were buying them by the millions. But having a car and having somewhere sensible to drive it were two different problems entirely. Cyrus Avery was an Oklahoma businessman and road booster who believed deeply, almost religiously, that a numbered national highway system could change the country. He lobbied, negotiated, and argued his way into a position where he could help design the route himself. In 1926, U.S. Route 66 was officially certified, a highway connecting Chicago, Illinois, to Santa Monica, California. Nearly 2,400 miles of road, cutting diagonally across 8 states: Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The diagonal path was itself a small act of geographic poetry. Most major highways of the era ran either north to south or east to west. Route 66 cut across the grain of the continent at an angle, which meant it passed through places other roads never bothered to reach: small towns, desert plateaus, river crossings, and stretches of open land that had never expected a paved road to arrive at their doorstep. It wasn't fully paved at first. Large sections remained gravel or packed dirt well into the early 1930s. Travelers who drove its early length described the experience as adventurous in ways that weren't entirely comfortable. Flat tires were routine, bridges washed out seasonally, and navigating between towns required a level of patience that modern driving simply doesn't demand. And yet people drove it. They drove it with a particular kind of eagerness, as if the road itself were a destination. There is something historians still quietly debate about why Route 66 captured the imagination so completely while other number highways of the same era faded into anonymity. Partly it was geography. The road moved through visually dramatic landscape, from the flat farmlands of the Midwest through the red mesas of New Mexico and Arizona toward the golden coast of California. Partly it was timing. The road arrived just as America was beginning to dream about what leisure travel might mean. But there was something else, harder to quantify. Route 66 ran through the American middle, through the places that felt most like the country's interior self. It wasn't a coastal road. It wasn't a mountain road. It was a road through the heartland, through small towns that took pride in being exactly what they were. You could feel that somehow, even now, even reading about it from a quiet room, there's something in the idea of that long diagonal road that feels like an invitation, unhurried, open, and pointed toward something luminous just beyond the next gentle rise in the land. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The road had been open for only a few years when the world it was built to serve began to come apart. The 1920s had been a decade of motion and confidence. Automobiles, radio, jazz, the sense that America was accelerating towards something bright and modern. Route 66 felt like part of that momentum, a ribbon of possibility laid across the continent by people who believed the future was simply a matter of getting there. Then, in 1929, the economy collapsed, and a few years after that, the sky itself seemed to turn against the land. The Dust Bowl is one of those historical events that resists easy imagination. Reading about it in numbers, the acres of topsoil lost, the cubic tons of displaced earth, the counties emptied of their populations, tells you something, but not quite enough. What it actually looked like was this: walls of darkness, sometimes a mile high, rolling across the southern plains with the slow, terrible patience of a weather system that had decided to become something else entirely. In parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, entire farming communities watched the horizon turn brown, then black, then simply swallow the afternoon. The agricultural practices of the previous decades had stripped the native grasses from millions of acres of prairie land. When the drought arrived in the early 1930s, there was nothing left to hold the soil in place. The wind took it. Families who had spent generations building farms on that land found themselves facing a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Stay and watch everything: crops, livestock, savings, the future itself, continue to disappear into the dust. Or leave. Most left. Route 66 became their road. John Steinbeck, who traveled portions of it while researching what would become the Grapes of Wrath, called it the Mother Road, a name that has stayed attached to the highway ever since. The phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the Freedom Road, not the Opportunity Road. The Mother Road. Something that carries you when you have nowhere else to go. Between 1930 and 1940, historians estimate that somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people traveled westward along Route 66, though the precise numbers remain genuinely uncertain because no one was counting in any systematic way. They came in overloaded trucks and failing automobiles, in farm wagons repurposed for distance travel, sometimes on foot pushing handcarts. They were called Okies, a term used with contempt at the time, though historians now tend to use it more carefully, noting that the migrants came from multiple states and varied backgrounds, united not by origin, but by displacement. If you had stood beside the road somewhere in eastern Oklahoma in the summer of 1935, you have seen a procession that had no real precedent in American history. Vehicles piled improbably high with furniture, bedding, cast iron cookware, children, dogs, the physical residue of entire domestic lives. Mattresses roped to rooftops, rocking chairs lashed to running boards. People moving slowly westward through heat that reached well above 100 degrees, through stretches of road that passed no town for 30 or 40 miles. The road itself, in places, was still not entirely paved. Certain sections through New Mexico and Arizona remained difficult, unpredictable. Tires failed constantly. Radiators boiled over in the desert heat. There are accounts from travelers of that era describing the roadside as lined with abandoned vehicles. Engines seized, frames broken, that simply could not complete the journey. Service station owners along the route remember, in oral histories collected decades later, the particular quality of those years. People arriving with no money, asking for water, asking if there was work nearby, asking questions the station owner had no good answer for. California, the supposed destination, was not always welcoming. The state at various points stationed guards at its borders, the so-called bum blockades, attempting to screen out migrants deemed likely to become public charges. Whether these measures were legal, effective, or humane was debated at the time and remains debated by historians today. And yet people kept coming. There's something in that persistence that is worth holding quietly for a moment. The road continued to carry people even when the road's promise was uncertain, even when what waited at the other end was not guaranteed to be better than what was left behind. Route 66 in those years was not a road of romance or leisure. It was a road of necessity, of grief, of the particular human determination to keep moving when staying has become impossible. But it was also, in small ways, a road of unexpected kindness. Account from the migration years include stories of strangers sharing food at roadsides, of mechanics making repairs for far less than the work was worth, of farm families in the small towns along the route leaving water jugs at the roadside for travelers passing through the night. The road held both things at once, hardship and quiet grace, in a way that significant human passages often do. It would not always be this heavy. In the years ahead, Route 66 would become something lighter, something almost celebratory. But those years of dust and slow migration left something in the road's character that never entirely left, a quality of seriousness underneath the neon, a memory of what movement costs when you have no choice but to move. Something shifted in the years after the Depression loosened its grip. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't uniform. Recovery moved unevenly across the country, arriving in some places years before it reached others. But gradually, through the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, the quality of movement along Route 66 began to change. The road that had carried grief westward began to carry something else alongside it. Curiosity, perhaps, the tentative return of pleasure. And with that shift, the roadside began to reinvent itself. The American roadside diner is so familiar now, so thoroughly absorbed into the visual language of nostalgia, that it takes a small effort to remember that it was once genuinely new, that someone, somewhere, had to decide for the first time that a gleaming metal building shaped like a railroad car, placed beside a highway in the middle of nowhere, might be exactly what a traveler needed. The earliest diners on Route 66 were modest affairs. Simple wooden structures with counters and stools, a few tables, a short-order cook visible through a pass-through window, a coffee pot that never quite emptied. They existed to feed people efficiently. Truck drivers, traveling salesmen, families stretching a long drive across a second day. But as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, something more deliberate began to happen to roadside architecture. Owners along the highway began to understand, almost instinctively, that visibility was its own form of commerce. A building that could be seen from half a mile away, that announced itself clearly and memorably against the flat landscape, would draw customers that a modest, well-behaved structure would simply fail to catch. And so the roadside began to speak, not quietly, not with restraint, with a particular American enthusiasm for making a point as large as possible and then illuminating it after dark. Neon arrived along Route 66 in the late 1930s and early 1940s like a second discovery of color. The technology itself had existed since the early 1900s, but its application to roadside signage transformed the American night in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Picture driving west through Oklahoma on a warm evening in 1947. The sky above you has gone the particular deep blue that precedes full dark, and the land on either side has softened into silhouette. And then, ahead on the right, perhaps 2 miles distant, a wash of pink and turquoise light rising above the tree line. A motel sign, a diner, an invitation rendered in glowing gas and glass, visible at a distance that no painted wooden board could ever match. Neon signs along Route 66 became objects of genuine artistry. Sign painters and glass benders competed for the attention of highway travelers with increasingly elaborate compositions, animated figures, flowing script, flickering flames, arrows that blinked in sequence to guide the eye toward an entrance. The Blue Swallow Motel in Tucumcari, New Mexico, installed a sign in 1940 that still stands today, its turquoise and orange neon considered by preservationists to be among the finest examples of the form ever made for a roadside establishment. The architecture itself became theatrical. Certain entrepreneurs along the highway grasped something important about the psychology of the road traveler, that after hours of featureless driving, the visual surprise of an unexpected structure created a genuine emotional response. Delight, curiosity, the desire to stop. This insight produced buildings that had no real precedent in the history of American commercial architecture. There were diners shaped like hats, like barrels, like locomotives. There were motels with swimming pools visible from the road, the shimmer of blue water being one of the most effective advertisements ever devised for desert-adjacent lodging. There were trading posts designed to suggest a fantasy of the American Southwest that owed as much to Hollywood as to actual Navajo or Pueblo architectural traditions, a blending of cultures and commerce that historians continue to examine with careful, sometimes critical attention. The roadside also became an important economic channel for Native American communities along the Route 66 corridor. Trading posts in New Mexico and Arizona sold genuine handmade pottery, woven blankets, silver work, and jewelry to travelers passing through. The relationship between the highway's tourist economy and indigenous artisans was complex, involving questions of fair compensation, cultural representation, and the degree to which travelers understood what they were purchasing. And those complexities deserve more careful examination than the nostalgic Route 66 narrative has always given them. But there was also, in among the commercial theater, something that felt genuinely communal about the roadside culture that Route 66 produced. The diner counter, specifically, was a democratic space in ways that other American social institutions of the era were not, or not always. Strangers sat beside strangers. Truck drivers ate next to traveling salesmen, ate next to families from 2 states away. Conversations began over shared coffee that would never have happened anywhere else. People exchanged road information the way sailors once exchanged charts. Which stretch was under construction? Which motel was actually clean? Where the best pie between Amarillo and Albuquerque could be reliably found. There was a geography of reputation along the road. Particular establishments that became known passed from traveler to traveler, accumulating a kind of word-of-mouth fame that existed entirely outside newspapers or formal advertising. Some of those reputations held for decades. You can still find people today, travelers who drove the road in its heyday, who will tell you without hesitation exactly which diner served the best chicken fried steak, exactly which motel had the softest beds, exactly which stretch of the road in the early morning light looked most like something from a painting. Memory works that way along certain roads. It holds the sensory details long after the facts have blurred. There's a particular kind of town that only a road can create. Not a town built around a river crossing, or a mining claim, or a railroad depot. The Route 66 passed through plenty of those too. This is something different. A town whose entire reason for existing is the fact of movement passing through it. A town that is, in its deepest economic logic, an extended act of hospitality toward strangers. Route 66 built dozens of these towns, and in doing so, it created communities whose identities became so thoroughly woven into the highway's existence that when the highway eventually changed, those identities would face a question they had never needed to ask before. Tucumcari, New Mexico, is perhaps the most evocative example. Before Route 66, Tucumcari was a small railroad town on the high desert plateau of northeastern New Mexico, serving the surrounding ranching community with modest commerce and little particular distinction. The highway changed its character entirely. By the 1950s, Tucumcari had become one of the most recognized stopping points on the entire length of Route 66. Not because of any single attraction, but because of the cumulative effect of its roadside infrastructure. At its peak, the town offered more than 2,000 motel rooms along a single commercial strip, a number extraordinary for a community of fewer than 10,000 people. The billboards for Tucumcari began appearing along the highway hundreds of miles in both directions. Travelers driving westward through the Texas Panhandle would encounter signs counting down the distance. Still 200 miles to Tucumcari, still 150, still 100, building a gentle anticipation that made the town feel like a destination rather than simply a convenient place to stop. This was deliberate. The town's business community understood early that the highway traveler's imagination needed to be engaged well before the traveler actually arrived. Flagstaff, Arizona, occupied a different position along the road. Already a community of some substance before Route 66. It sat at the junction of several older trade routes and had a railroad presence dating to the 1880s. Flagstaff became one of the highway's significant urban anchors, offering travelers the particular relief of a genuine downtown after long stretches of open desert. The town sits at an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet, surrounded by ponderosa pine forest and volcanic mountain scenery that struck most approaching travelers as genuinely surprising after the flatness and heat of the lower desert. People stopped in Flagstaff not only for practical reasons, but because the place itself demanded a pause. Local historians note that Flagstaff developed a particular culture of hospitality during the Route 66 era, a self-conscious civic pride in being the kind of town where travelers wanted to linger. Restaurants competed on quality rather than merely on visibility. Independent bookshops and craft galleries appeared alongside the diners and motor courts. The town acquired, over time, a certain texture that distinguished it from the purely commercial roadside stops that surrounded it. Not every Route 66 town was large enough to anchor itself that way. Some of the most affecting communities along the highway were the very small ones. Towns of a few hundred people whose entire economic metabolism depended on the road in a much more direct and fragile sense. Afton, Oklahoma. Ash Fork, Arizona. Newkirk, New Mexico. These were places where the diner on the highway was not one commercial option among many, but quite possibly the town's primary employer. Where the filling station was run by a family that had operated it for 3 generations, whose children had grown up helping pump gasoline and check tire pressure for strangers passing through. The social geography of these small Route 66 towns had a particular quality worth considering. The highway brought strangers through constantly, people from different states, different backgrounds, different economic circumstances. Small-town residents who might otherwise have spent their lives in relative social homogeneity instead grew up in daily contact with a remarkable variety of Americans in motion. Oral histories collected from residents of small Route 66 towns consistently mention this as a formative experience. The sense that the larger world was always just outside the diner window, moving past in both directions, visible and occasionally in conversation. The towns also developed their own internal hierarchies and microeconomics in relation to the highway. The filling station owner occupied a position of genuine civic importance, not only as a commercial operator, but as an information node. Travelers stopped for gasoline and left with directions, road condition reports, restaurant recommendations, and warnings about the stretch ahead. In an era before reliable roadside communication systems, the knowledge held by a well-situated filling station operator was genuinely valuable. Similarly, the proprietors of the larger motor courts along the highway maintained an informal network of referrals among themselves. If one establishment was full, the owner would often direct arriving travelers to a neighbor's property rather than simply turn them away, a cooperative behavior that historians of roadside commerce find somewhat remarkable given the competitive context in which it occurred. There was, in these small transactions and informal arrangements, something that functioned almost like a community extending itself along the length of the road. A distributed town, stretched across 2,000 miles, whose members rarely met, but whose livelihoods were bound together by the shared fact of the highway running through all of them. That sense of distributed belonging, of being part of something larger than your particular stretch of asphalt, gave Route 66 towns a collective identity that went beyond mere commercial self-interest. It made the road feel, to those who lived along it, like something genuinely theirs. Something remarkable happened to America in the years after the Second World War ended. A country that had spent 4 years organizing itself entirely around the logic of sacrifice. Rationed gasoline, rationed rubber, deferred pleasures, collective effort directed toward a distant and terrible necessity, suddenly found itself on the other side of all that. The factories retooled, the soldiers came home, and an entire nation, having been told for years to wait, began to move. The timing coincided with something else. Returning veterans, many of whom had married quickly before deployment, were now starting families at a rate that demographers would later struggle to adequately describe. The suburbs were expanding outward from every American city. Affordable housing, affordable automobiles, and a newly completed system of paved roads created conditions for a particular kind of life, spread out, mobile, oriented toward the horizon. Route 66, already present and already storied, was perfectly positioned for what came next. The 1950s transformed the highway into something it had never quite been before, a destination in itself. This is a subtle but important distinction. In the Depression years, the road had been a means of escape, a path toward somewhere else, taken out of necessity. In the post-war decade, for millions of American families, the road became the experience. The driving was the point. Family vacations by automobile became a defining ritual of post-war, middle-class American life. Fathers mapped routes on kitchen tables in the evenings. Mothers packed coolers and organized travel games for the back seat. Children pressed their faces against car windows, watching the landscape change from the flat green familiarity of the Midwest into something stranger and more colorful with every 100 miles. Route 66 offered what no other American highway could quite match, a journey that changed its character completely and repeatedly across its length. The Illinois cornfields gave way to Missouri's rolling hills. Missouri opened into the Oklahoma plains. Oklahoma sharpened into the Texas panhandle. Texas dissolved into the New Mexico high desert. New Mexico rose into Arizona's volcanic plateau. Arizona descended through the painted desert into the Mojave. And the Mojave eventually, impossibly, ended at the Pacific. This variety was the highway's greatest gift to the post-war traveler. The automobile itself had changed considerably from the vehicles that carried Depression-era migrants westward. The cars of the 1950s were objects of genuine aesthetic ambition. Automotive designers, influenced partly by the aerodynamic forms of military aircraft they had observed during the war years, produced vehicles whose chrome grills, tail fins, and sweeping body lines made them feel, to the people who drove them, like something slightly futuristic. Driving a 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air or a 1957 Ford Fairlane across the open desert wasn't merely transportation. It was a statement, however unconscious, about the kind of country America believed itself to be in those years. Roadside culture adapted quickly to this more prosperous, more optimistic traveler. Motor courts evolved into motels. The word itself, a contraction of motor and hotel, reportedly coined in California in the 1920s, but popularized nationally during the post-war boom. The new motels were more architecturally ambitious than their cabin court predecessors, with swimming pools as standard features, ice machines in the corridors, and televisions bolted to dresser tops. They competed on comfort rather than merely on availability. The diners, too, were reinventing themselves. Many upgraded their interiors with the visual vocabulary of the atomic age: boomerang pattern Formica countertops, kidney-shaped tables, starbursts on the walls, colors that suggested optimism through sheer chromatic enthusiasm. The post-war American diner was, in its cheerfully excessive way, a piece of designed experience, an environment calibrated to make you feel that the world was modern and the future was bright and the coffee would be refilled without your having to ask. There is a particular pleasure in the drive itself that people of this era described in ways worth pausing to consider. Before the interstates, before navigation systems, before the reduction of driving to a series of managed steps, road travel required a kind of active geographic engagement that has largely disappeared from the experience. You read the road. You track the sun. You followed signage that was sometimes contradictory, sometimes missing, sometimes charmingly approximate in its distance estimates. Getting slightly lost was not a failure. It was a normal part of the journey, and occasionally produced the most memorable discoveries. A small-town rodeo glimpsed through a car window. A diner not on any map that turned out to serve extraordinary food. A stretch of road so beautiful in the late afternoon light that the family pulled over simply to look at it. Historians of American leisure culture argue, with some evidence, that this kind of unscripted travel produced a different relationship to place than the more managed tourism that followed. When you could not predict exactly what the road would offer, you paid attention differently. The highway in those years carried something else too, less comfortable to examine. American prosperity in the 1950s was not uniformly distributed, and access to Route 60 SXS pleasures was not uniformly available. African American travelers navigating the highway during this era did so within the constraints of segregation, navigating which diners would serve them, which motels would accept them, relying on publications like the Green Book, a travel guide specifically designed to identify establishments where Black travelers could expect respectful treatment. This history runs alongside the sunlit nostalgia of the post-war road trip in ways that cannot be separated from it. The romance of the open road was real, and it was not equally available to everyone driving it. Both things are true, and both deserve to be held. There is a particular kind of American ingenuity that expresses itself not in efficiency or elegance, but in sheer audacity of scale and strangeness. Route 66 became its natural home. By the 1950s, the highway had developed enough of a traveler culture. Enough people with enough leisure time and enough disposable income and enough willingness to be surprised that a new category of roadside enterprise became not merely possible, but genuinely profitable. The attraction, the curiosity, the thing you stopped for not because you needed anything, but because you simply could not drive past it without wondering what it was. These landmarks were not planned by committees or designed by architects with credentials. They emerged from individual imaginations, from people who had an idea so particular, so stubbornly specific to themselves, that the only way to properly understand their motivation is to accept that some human beings simply need to build a motel shaped like a wigwam and leave it at that. The wigwam motels deserve to be considered carefully because they represent something genuinely interesting about the relationship between roadside commerce, American mythology, and the complicated history of how non-Native Americans imagined and performed indigenous culture in the mid-20th century. There were originally 7 wigwam motels across the American road system, designed by architect Frank Redford and built beginning in the 1930s. The most famous surviving examples on Route 66 are in Holbrook, Arizona, and Rialto, California. Concrete structures shaped to resemble teepees, which are themselves dwellings associated with Plains Indian cultures rather than with the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, where several of the motels were located. The conflation was not accidental ignorance exactly. It was the product of a broadly circulated, Hollywood-reinforced popular image of Native American life that collapsed enormous cultural diversity into a single visual shorthand. Travelers who stayed in the wigwam units were, in a sense, sleeping inside a misconception. Historians and cultural critics have examined these structures with increasing attention in recent decades, asking questions about what it meant for white American tourists to pay for the novelty of sleeping in a shape associated with cultures that were simultaneously being displaced and romanticized. These are questions without simple answers. The motels were, and remain, visually extraordinary. They were also products of a cultural moment that deserves honest examination. Not all of Route 60 SX's eccentric landmarks carried this kind of complexity. Some were simply expressions of joyful, inexplicable human creativity. The blue whale of Catoosa, Oklahoma, is perhaps the purest example. In the early 1970s, just at the edge of the highway's decline, a man named Hugh Davis built a large, smiling blue whale sculpture beside a pond on his property near Route 66 as an anniversary gift for his wife, who collected whale figurines. The whale was approximately 80 feet long. It was blue. It smiled. Davis added a slide from the whale's back into the pond and opened the area as a free swimming hole for the community. The blue whale was never a commercial enterprise. It was never designed to be a landmark. It was a personal gesture that became a beloved local institution through sheer force of its own gentle absurdity. It still stands today, repainted and maintained by volunteers, still smiling beside its pond in northeastern Oklahoma. There were others scattered along the highway's length like punctuation marks in a very long and peculiar sentence. Merrimack Caverns in Missouri began advertising itself along Route 66 beginning in the 1930s, with a barn painting campaign that placed its name on hundreds of barns across multiple states, a form of roadside advertising so pervasive that it became its own kind of landmark. The caverns themselves were real and genuinely spectacular, but the marketing was perhaps the more remarkable achievement. The Cadillac Ranch, just west of Amarillo, Texas, 10 Cadillacs buried nose first in a wheat field at the same angle as the Cheops Pyramid slope, installed in 1974 by an eccentric art collective called the Ant Farm, became one of the highway's most photographed sites almost immediately. Travelers were invited to spray paint the cars, which meant the artwork was in constant, layered transformation, accumulating the marks of thousands of passing strangers in a kind of unplanned collaborative artwork. The giant blue whale, the Cadillac Ranch, the Wigwam motels, the 2-story tall fiberglass Paul Bunyan figure in Atlanta, Illinois, holding a hot dog rather than an axe because the hot dog stand that commissioned him wanted to advertise their product rather than the lumber industry. These things existed along the same road. They shared geography with the serious history of the Depression migration, with the complicated politics of indigenous representation, with the ordinary daily commerce of diners and filling stations, and the genuine human effort of small-town survival. Route 66 was always large enough to contain all of it. This is perhaps what made it different from other roads. Not just its length or its diagonal ambition, but its remarkable capacity to hold contradictions without resolving them. The serious and the absurd, the historically weighty and the cheerfully pointless, the beautiful and the slightly ridiculous, all existing within the same two-lane corridor, stretching across the same continent. You could drive from a Navajo trading post selling genuine handmade silver jewelry to a concrete wigwam motel built on a misunderstanding of Navajo culture, to a diner serving pie that had been perfected over 30 years, to a field full of buried Cadillacs, all within the same afternoon. And somehow, improbably, it all felt like the same road. There's a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony or declaration. There is no single moment you could point to afterward and say, there, that was when it changed. Instead, change comes in the way that weather sometimes comes to open country. Gradually at first, then all at once, and by the time you fully understand what is happening, the landscape has already shifted around you. This is how Route 66 began to end. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 is not a document that reads like a death sentence for anything. It is a piece of infrastructure legislation, dry, technical, concerned with load tolerances and interchange geometries and funding formulas and the projected carrying capacity of roads not yet built. President Dwight Eisenhower signed into law in June of that year, and what it authorized was the construction of the Interstate highway system, a network of high-speed, limited-access roads that would eventually stretch across the entire country, connecting major cities with a consistency and efficiency that the older federal highway system Route 66 included, had never been designed to provide. Eisenhower's enthusiasm for the interstate system was genuine and long-standing. He had observed the German Autobahn during the Second World War and been impressed by its military utility, the ability to move troops and equipment rapidly across a country's interior. He had also, as a young Army officer in 1919, participated in the Army's first transcontinental motor convoy, a grueling 2-month journey from Washington to San Francisco along roads so poor that the convoy averaged fewer than 6 miles per hour. The memory had never entirely left him. The interstate system was presented to the American public primarily as a defense measure. The roads would allow rapid military movement in the event of a national emergency, but its civilian implications were immediately understood by everyone involved. Route 66 was not immediately bypassed. The process was gradual, town by town, stretch by stretch, over a period of more than 2 decades. The interstate highways were designed to move traffic as efficiently as possible between major urban centers. This meant avoiding exactly the things that Route 66 had been built to connect: the small towns, the roadside businesses, the human texture of the American interior. Where Route 66 curved into a town's main street and became, for a few blocks, the town's commercial artery, the interstate bypassed the town entirely, sometimes by several miles. The first bypasses were met with protests from the affected communities. Civic groups organized. Letters were written to state highway departments and congressional representatives. Some towns managed to negotiate interchange positions that preserved some portion of their highway traffic. Others simply watched the new road go up in the distance and began, quietly, to count the days. The economics were brutally simple. A traveler on a new interstate did not pass through town, did not stop at the diner, did not spend the night at the motel, did not fill up at the filling station on Main Street, did not buy souvenirs or pie or a cup of coffee, did not even know the town was there. The businesses along Route 66 felt the change before any official announcement confirmed what was happening. Traffic counts dropped, not dramatically at first, 10% decline, then 15, then more. The diners that had once turned tables continuously through the lunch hour found themselves with empty stools by mid-morning. The motels that had posted no vacancy signs every summer night began leaving their signs dark. Some owners adapted. They advertised more aggressively, lowered prices, diversified their offerings, positioned themselves as an alternative to the interstate's standardized chain restaurants and franchise motels. A few of these strategies worked, at least for a while. But the chains themselves were part of the problem or part of the change, depending on your perspective. Holiday Inn, Howard Johnson's, McDonald's, and their competitors had developed a business model precisely calibrated to the new interstate traveler. Consistent, predictable, identical from one location to the next. The traveler who had once sought the particular pleasures of the unknown roadside, the diner whose pie might be extraordinary or merely adequate, could now choose certainty instead. Certainty turned out to be popular. Route 66 was officially decertified as a United States highway on June 27, 1985. The decision was administrative rather than dramatic. A removal from the official highway numbering system, the replacement of its distinctive shields with other designations along the portions absorbed into the interstate network. No ceremony marked the occasion. No one gathered to watch the signs come down. In many of the small towns along the highway's length, the decertification confirmed something that had already been felt for years. The traffic had already gone. The diners had already closed. The neon signs had already gone dark, their glass tubes cold and dusty inside their weathered frames. What remained was the road itself, still physically present, still running its diagonal course across the continent, still passing through the towns it had built and the landscapes it had revealed. But quieter now. Much, much quieter. There is something about the silence that settled over Route 66 in those years that resists easy characterization. It was not simply absence. It was the presence of what had been, the ghost of a particular kind of American motion that had passed through and left its outlines behind in the architecture, in the faded paint, in the weeds growing through the parking lot of a diner that had served its last cup of coffee on some unremarkable Tuesday afternoon and simply never opened again. The road had carried so much grief, hope, pleasure, ambition, the full complicated weight of American movement across a century. And now it lay quietly under the open sky, still pointing west, still patient, still there. There's a word that gets used often in connection with Route 60 SIXS abandoned places, and it is worth examining carefully before accepting it too readily. Ghost town. The phrase conjures something specific, the Hollywood image of a windswept main street, tumbleweeds rolling past the hollow eyes of empty windows, a place so completely evacuated of human presence that it has become purely atmospheric. Scenery rather than history. A backdrop. But most of the places that Route 66 left behind were not ghost towns in that theatrical sense. They were something more complicated and in many ways more affecting. They were towns that had lost their economic purpose but retained their human presence. Communities where people continued to live and work and care for their neighbors in the diminished aftermath of the highway's withdrawal, in the particular quiet of a place that the larger world had simply stopped noticing. Glen Rio sits exactly on the Texas-New Mexico state line, which means that at its modest peak it existed in two states simultaneously, a geographic curiosity that had minor practical implications for the town's liquor licensing in the years when Texas was dry and New Mexico was not. The town grew up entirely around Route 66, and when the highway was bypassed by Interstate 40, Glen Rio was bypassed so completely that not even an interchange was provided. The interstate simply moved north, leaving Glen Rio on an access road that went nowhere anyone needed to go. What remains today is a small collection of structures in various states of peaceful deterioration. A filling station, a diner, a few residential buildings, standing in the enormous silence of the Texas-New Mexico border country, surrounded by a landscape of such immense horizontal scale that the sky seems to press down on everything with a gentle, democratic weight. Photographers and travelers who seek out Glen Rio describe the experience in strikingly similar terms. Not sadness exactly, something closer to stillness. The particular quality of a place where time has become visible in the materials themselves, in peeling paint and rusting metal, and would returning gradually to the color of the earth around it. Nowhere, Oklahoma, is a town that technically no longer exists as an incorporated municipality, though its name persists on older maps and in the memories of people who passed through it during the highway's active years. The story of Nowhere is, in its way, the most honest summary of what happened to dozens of small Route 66 communities. A filling station, a small diner, a few houses clustered near the road in a location whose only distinction was its position on the highway. When the highway's traffic disappeared, the filling station closed. The diner followed. The few families who had depended on the road's commerce moved to larger towns. The houses gradually emptied. The name remained. It has a quality of accidental poetry that Route 66 historians find difficult to overlook. Not all of Route 60 SIXS abandoned places were towns. Some were individual structures, single buildings that had stood for decades as landmarks on a particular stretch of road and then, in the years after the highway's decline, gradually transformed from functioning businesses into something else. Objects of curiosity, subjects of photographs, destinations for a new kind of traveler who sought them out specifically because of their emptiness rather than in spite of it. The abandoned Two Guns, Arizona, is perhaps the most dramatically storied of these. Originally a trading post and tourist attraction that had operated under various owners and schemes since the 1920s, including a brief period in which it marketed itself as the site of a battle between Navajo and Apache raiders, a historical claim that was largely invented. Two Guns had already experienced a colorful and occasionally violent history before Route 60 SXS decline made it simply one more empty structure in the Arizona desert. What stands there now? Roofless stone walls, the ruins of a small zoo that once housed mountain lions for tourist entertainment, the empty cages still visible amid the desert vegetation, has become one of the most photographed sites along the entire old highway alignment. The ruins are, in their way, beautiful. The desert has moved into them with characteristic patience and turned them into something that feels almost geological in its settled stillness. There's a particular kind of beauty in these places that is worth naming without apology. The aesthetics of decay, the visual qualities of weathered wood, faded paint, rust patterns on metal, the way vegetation moves into human structures and makes them collaborative. These have been recognized by photographers and artists as genuinely compelling since at least the early 20th century. There is nothing morbid about finding beauty in a crumbling diner or a roofless filling station. It is simply the beauty of time made visible in materials. What gives Route 60 success abandoned places their particular emotional resonance beyond the purely visual is the layering of human stories they contain. The diner in Glen Rio was not always a ruin. It was, for some decades, a place where real people prepared food and served it to strangers and talked across the counter about the road ahead. The filling station in nowhere was where a family built a life, however modest, however contingent on the highway's continuous existence. The abandonment is not the whole story. It is only the most recent chapter. And even in the most empty stretches of the old highway, emptiness is never quite complete. There are still people in these places. Not many. Sometimes just one or two families holding on in a town that the census barely registers, but present nonetheless. Tending small gardens in the shadow of buildings the world has forgotten. Keeping a dog. Watching the occasional curious traveler slow down on the old road and stop to take a photograph of something they find beautiful in the wreckage. These remaining residents are not remnants or curiosities. They are people who made a choice, sometimes consciously and sometimes simply by staying when others left, to remain in a place that meant something to them independent of its economic function. That choice, quiet and unremarkable and entirely human, is perhaps the most moving thing the abandoned highway has to show. There is a particular kind of love that expresses itself through persistence, not the dramatic love of grand gestures or sudden revelations, but the quieter kind, the love that shows up every morning and does the small necessary things year after year without particular acknowledgement or reward, simply because the alternative, allowing something meaningful to disappear without a fight, is genuinely unacceptable to the person who feels it. Route 66 attracted this kind of love in remarkable quantities. In the years following the highway's desertification, as the larger world moved on and the interstate carried everyone who had somewhere urgent to be, a different kind of person began to pay attention to what was being left behind. Historians, photographers, local residents who had grown up beside the road and could not quite accept that its story was finished. Travelers who had driven it once and returned because something about it refused to leave them alone. These people, uncoordinated at first, working independently in their particular towns and stretches of road, would eventually form the backbone of one of the most unusual preservation movements in American history. Angel Delgadillo is perhaps the most celebrated of Route 60 SIXS human keepers. Born in 1927 in Seligman, Arizona, a small town along the highway's Arizona alignment, Delgadillo spent his adult life as a barber in the same shop his father had operated before him. When Route 66 was bypassed by Interstate 40 in 1978, Seligman's economic life collapsed with a speed that was almost physical in its impact. Businesses closed within months. Families left. The town that had existed in confident relation to the highway's traffic found itself suddenly, completely peripheral. Delgadillo did not leave. In 1987, He helped organize what became the historic Route 66 Association of Arizona, gathering together local business owners and residents from towns along the Highways Arizona alignment to collectively advocate for preservation and tourism development. The meeting that launched the association was held in his barbershop, a small room above the highway where he had been cutting hair for decades, the walls covered with photographs and memorabilia from the road's active years. The barbershop is still there. Delgadillo, who lived into his 90s and became one of the most interviewed and photographed figures in Route 66 history, continued to give haircuts and talk to visitors about the road he loved until well past the age when most people have retired entirely from everything. His particular genius was not organizational or political, though he was effective at both. It was something simpler. He understood that the road story was worth telling, and he told it to everyone who came through his door with the patient enthusiasm of someone who has never grown tired of the subject. The preservation movement that Delgadillo helped catalyze was formally recognized when Route 66 was designated a National Scenic Byway in 1999, an acknowledgement that the road had cultural and historical significance worth protecting, even if it no longer functioned as a primary transportation corridor. But institutional recognition, while useful, was never quite the point for the individuals who had been doing the work long before any official body took notice. In Tucumcari, New Mexico, a woman named Lillian Redman operated the Blue Swallow Motel for decades after most comparable establishments had closed, keeping it open and maintained with the specific intention of preserving what the Route 66 motel experience had actually been, not as a museum, but as a functioning place where travelers could actually stay, actually sleep in beds that had been made for them, actually wake up in the morning and find coffee ready and the old highway waiting outside. The door. Redman's approach represented a philosophy of preservation through use rather than preservation through freezing. The idea that a living place is more honestly preserved by continuing to function than by being locked behind glass. The photographers deserve particular acknowledgement. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, a growing community of documentary photographers turned their attention to Route 60 SIXS abandoned landscapes with a seriousness and sustained commitment that produced an extraordinary visual archive of the highway's transition. Their work was not straightforwardly elegiac. The best of it was too honest for simple mourning. What they documented was not just loss, but transformation. The road in the process of becoming something different from what it had been, the buildings in the process of returning to the landscape, the communities in the process of redefining themselves around a new and more complicated relationship to their own history. These photographs, many of them now held in university archives and historical society collections, constitute one of the most important records of mid-20th century American commercial culture anywhere in existence. They preserve not just the visual appearance of the road, but the specific texture of materials, the particular colors of mid-century signage, the exact geometry of a 1950s motel's roof line, in ways that would otherwise have been entirely lost. There were also the writers. Michael Wallace published his comprehensive history of Route 66 in 1990, a book that is credited by many in the preservation community with bringing the highway to a new national audience at a moment when it might otherwise have simply continued its quiet decline into obscurity. The book was researched through years of travel along the actual road, interviewing the people who had lived and worked along it, the Delgadillos, the motel proprietors, the diner cooks, the filling station families, and its texture reflects that ground-level intimacy. Before Wallace, Route 66 nostalgia had been largely local, something felt by people who had direct connection to the road. After his book, it became something more broadly accessible, a story that people who had never driven the road could enter and feel the particular pull of. What all these keepers shared across their different methods and disciplines was a belief that Route 66 was not merely a piece of transportation infrastructure that had been superseded by a more efficient alternative. It was a record of how Americans had moved through their own country across a particular century. A physical archive of commercial creativity and individual ambition and community formation and cultural contradiction. A road that had carried both the best and the most complicated aspects of American life along its diagonal course from the Great Lakes to the Pacific, letting it disappear without witness, without record, without the effort of memory. This was what none of them could accept. And so they stayed, and they worked, and they kept telling the story. Something unexpected happened to Route 66 after it was declared finished. It became more itself. This is not the kind of outcome that infrastructure planners anticipate when they reroute traffic away from a road. The expectation, reasonable enough on its surface, is that a road without traffic is a road in decline. Economically, culturally, in every measurable sense, moving toward irrelevance. The numbers support this. The census data from the towns along the old alignment support this. The closed diners and dark neon signs and empty parking lots support this. And yet something else was also happening, quietly and without official acknowledgement, in the years after the highway lost its functional purpose. Route 66 was becoming legendary. Legends require a particular kind of distance to form. While the highway was simply a road, while it was doing the ordinary daily work of moving people and goods between the cities of the American interior, it could not quite be mythologized. It was too present, too functional, too embedded in the practical textures of everyday life to be seen clearly as a whole. When the interstates drew the traffic away and the road fell quiet, that distance became possible. And into that distance rushed something that had been accumulating all along. The stories, the photographs, the songs, the novels, the particular quality of American longing that attaches itself to open roads and vanishing horizons, and the idea that somewhere west of wherever you are, something luminous is waiting. John Steinbeck had given the road its name, the Mother Road, but it was the highway's quieter years that gave the name its full weight. Bobby Troupe's 1946 song, with its invitation to get your kicks on Route 66, became not merely a popular number, but a kind of cultural shorthand for an entire mode of American freedom. Recorded by artists from Nat King Cole to the Rolling Stones to Depeche Mode across 7 decades, each version finding something new in the same spare lyric. The road had become a frequency that different generations tuned into differently, each hearing something that answered a need particular to their moment. International travelers discovered Route 66 in the 1980s and 1990s in numbers that surprised even the preservation advocates who had been working to keep it visible. European travelers, especially from Germany, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, arrived on the old highway with a devotion that sometimes exceeded that of American travelers who had grown up with it. There was something in the road's combination of open landscape, mid-century architecture, and encoded American mythology that spoke powerfully to people who had grown up with Hollywood westerns and post-war American music and the particular European fascination with American scale and space. A German Route 66 club, founded in 1990, eventually grew to several thousand members. People who had never lived in any of the 8 states the highway traversed, but who felt a genuine personal connection to the road story. Similar organizations formed in the United Kingdom, in Japan, in Australia. This international dimension of Route 66's afterlife is one of the genuinely curious aspects of its story, and one that historians of American cultural export find endlessly interesting. The road had become, in its abandonment, a more universal symbol than it had ever been in its functional prime, an image of something that people in many different countries recognized as meaningful, even if what they recognized in it was partly their own projected longing rather than the road's specific American history. The road today is a complicated and beautiful mixture of all its accumulated histories. There are stretches of the old alignment that are impeccably maintained, where local associations and state historic preservation offices have worked together to repave, re-sign, and restore the roadside environment to something resembling its mid-century appearance. These sections attract steady streams of travelers in rented vehicles, motorcycles, and vintage automobiles making deliberate pilgrimages along the full length of the old highway. There are stretches that remain in various states of creative deterioration. The cracked asphalt and weathered structures that photographers and artists continue to find endlessly generative, the beautiful ruins that the desert is slowly and patiently reclaiming. And there are the stretches that have simply become ordinary local roads, serving the communities that remained, carrying the daily traffic of people going to work and school and the grocery store and back. The highway's legendary status entirely irrelevant to the practical business of Tuesday morning. All three are the real Route 66. None of them is more authentic than the others. The cars that travel the road today come from everywhere. A retired couple from Ohio in a rented convertible, working their way methodically from Chicago to Santa Monica, checking towns off a list they have been making for 30 years. A young Japanese traveler on a rented Harley-Davidson, photographing everything, having memorized the road's geography from books and films before ever setting foot in America. A family from New Mexico, driving the section that passes through their home state with a grandmother who remembers when the road was simply where you went to get things done. They stop at the Blue Swallow Motel and find it still open, still beautiful, still glowing turquoise and orange against the New Mexico night. They stop at Angel Delgadillo's barber shop and find, or found for many years, a man who would tell them the road's story with the warmth of someone for whom it has never grown old. They drive through Glen Rio and feel the silence and find it beautiful rather than merely sad. They stop at the Cadillac Ranch and add their own layer of spray paint to the accumulated decades of color, and drive away having left a small mark on something that will outlast them. Route 66 was officially decommissioned. It was never officially finished. There's a difference between those two things that the road itself seems to understand. That long diagonal line, still running from the shores of Lake Michigan to the edge of the Pacific, still passing through the same landscapes, still carrying the same quality of open invitation that has carried since Cyrus Avery and his colleagues laid a ruler across a map of the American continent and drew a line. The neon still glows in places. The pie is still good in certain diners that have held on through everything. The horizon still opens ahead of you in the way that horizons only open on roads that were designed with something more than efficiency in mind. The road still breathes. And if you listen carefully in the particular quiet of a Route 66 evening, somewhere west of Oklahoma City, say, with the sky going coral and the road ahead empty and the smell of warm asphalt rising in the cooling air, you can hear it. There are roads, and then there are roads that become something more than roads. Route 66 crossed that line a long time ago. So long ago, in fact, that it is now difficult to remember a time when it was simply a piece of infrastructure, a numbered corridor between points A and B, a practical solution to the problem of continental distance. It has been a symbol for so long that the symbol and the road have become inseparable, each informing the other, each borrowing resonance from the other, in the way that places and their meanings eventually fuse into a single indivisible thing. Tonight, lying quietly wherever you are, you have traveled the whole length of it, or something like the whole length, which is perhaps the closest any traveler ever truly comes. You have stood in the dust of the Oklahoma Panhandle beside overloaded trucks in the summer of 1935 and eaten pie at a counter that gleamed with the optimism of 1952 and watched a neon sign come alive against the New Mexico dusk in colors that had no real name in any language before someone thought to bend glass tubes into the shapes of arrows and fill them with glowing gas and point them at passing strangers. You have felt the particular silence of a road the world has moved past, and you have felt the quieter, more persistent sound of the people who stayed beside it, who kept its story alive through the simple insistence of continuing to tell it. The road does not need you to do anything with this. It has been traveling westward for 100 years without particular concern for whether anyone was watching. It will continue to do so, patient and diagonal and pointed toward the Pacific, long after every traveler who has ever driven its length has found their own quieter rest. For now, let the road go on without you. Let it carry its freight of memory westward through the dark. Let the neon signs glow in the desert, and the diners keep their coffee warm, and the horizon stay open and luminous at whatever hour it chooses. You have traveled far enough for one night. Close your eyes. Feel the particular weight of having been somewhere real, even in imagination. Feel the road beneath you settling into the earth the way all roads eventually do, patiently, permanently, still pointing towards something worth going to. Sweet dreams.